I'm very excited. This is the first time I spoken to an SSA-related event, and a very big fan of the organization, so I'm very excited. I am right now I'm the managing partner and research director at Socioanalytica Research, which is a research consulting firm. I do polling, focus groups, data analysis for organizations. And I have over 20 years now experience in survey research, in particular in academia, think tanks, and the private sector. I was part of a few research teams at the Trinity College American Religious Identification Survey in 2008 for the Institute of Secularism, the study of secularism, society, and culture. I was at the Public Religion Research Institute from 2012 to 2014. I've also worked with Dr. Joe Blankholm in the Secular Community Survey a few years back. Consulted with American Atheists in their U.S. Secular Survey. So I've been kind of like the Forrest Gump of secular studies, being essentially involved in most of the big surveys that have come up in some way or another, with the exception of the Pew surveys, which we're actually going to talk about these throughout the conversation. And I also, which is the origin of this presentation, I also published the newsletter, Secular Politics. And there I write about secularism issues in terms of political organization, voters, elected officials, and views on demographic and political trends. And with that, also has a spin-off to a project called the Secular Vote, sorry, that I co-founded with Sarah Levin of Secular Strategies. So at the end, I'm going to mention a little bit more of that, so you can visit those projects. But in the meantime, the new secular boom is part of what I call a rant that I did in my newsletter. It's kind of funny, but usually the ranty posts are the ones that call the most attention. And it comes from, I started writing about the findings from the latest Pew Research Center's Religious Landscape Survey, in which it finds that the secular population, and by secular I mean the people who identify as non-religious, what Pew calls the religiously unaffiliated, what it's known as the Nones, N-O-N-E-S, that a lot of the commentary, particularly mainstream media and other outlets, has been about whether the knowns, the growth of secularism among the U.S. population has stalled or plateaued, and whether Christianity or religion more broadly is making a comeback. And so I've been like fighting over those concepts and whether secularism has actually stopped happening or is stopping in some way, and whether Christianity is actually making a comeback. And so this presentation is a combination of all discussion from those newsletters, but also like new analysis and new perspectives in terms of what I think is going to happen moving forward, which I didn't have time to do when I wrote that piece like two months ago or so. And so I want to start by talking about an overview of what we're going to be talking. First, I'm going to be talking about the secular boom and what do I mean? What is the secular boom, or what's the secular boom? Then the secular plateau, and then I'm going to talk about the next boom or the new boom, depending on the slide. But it essentially means the same, like what's going to happen if there's going to be a new secular boom, or there's going to come a boom or a proliferation of non-religious people coming from elsewhere at some point. And so when I talk about the secular boom, I mean of this period probably starting in the early 90s up to probably today, we can still call it, in which the people in the United States who identify as non-religious, whether it's atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, like the way Pew phrases the answer options to that question, or whether people who say they have no religion in other surveys that allowed for that option, or people who say they have none in other surveys that have that option, uh, started particularly in the 1990s, and since at least 2007, 2008, has become a particularly important part of the US population. And I'm going to show you, this is the trend from the General Social Survey, which also asks the question a little differently than the Pew Research Center, PRRI, Gallup. They all have different styles of asking this question about religious sanctification. But this one is the longest one because it goes back to the mid 1970s. And as you can see, that trend has been essentially flat through the 70s, 80s, where fewer than 1 in 10 adults in the US actually identified as non-religious or as having no religion. And then you start having a bump in the mid 1990s, which has, with some ebbs and flows, like yearly variation, it actually has continued increasing up to 2024, 2023, I think is the last data point. And because, of course, the scale is not up to 100, it's not that smooth, but essentially 1 year, in I think that's 2022, is 27%, the next year is 25%, not particularly different statistically speaking. But when I talk about the secular boom, I talk about precisely that point between the mid 90s and today, in which the population continues to increase as a share of the adult population. And when people talk about the increasing secularism in the United States, it's essentially about this: religious identity, affiliation. But many, like sociologists, I'm not a sociologist, I'm a political scientist. But I work with a lot of sociologists. And so they have these concepts called the belief, belonging, and behavior. And so here, this comes from the 3 Pew landscape surveys from 2007, 2014, 2024. And what has happened is that it's not just belief, and in this case, the question I chose was people who believe in God, and in this case, the chart shows people who do not believe in God. The belonging is people who say that they affiliate with a religion, and in this case, it's people who do not affiliate with a religion. So your knowns or your unaffiliated, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particulars. And then the behavior is, in this case, attending religious services. And in this case, is people who say that they never or seldom go to church or to attend other religious services. And so the secular boom has not just been about people abandoning religion in terms of identifying as not being member of a religion or not being part of a religious not having a religious identity, but also have been, since 2007, according to Pew, 3 times a tripling in the proportion of atheists, essentially, in the country. People who say they do not believe in God. And that's not going with all the nuances of the question, in which, like, some people believe but not as much, and they could be classified as agnostics. It's people who say they do not. So it's 16% of the US population right now. It's atheist by belief. 29% of the US adult population does not affiliate with a religion, so nearly 3 in 10. Which is a big deal because it's nearly doubled from what it was 1 generation ago, just 16%, according to this survey. And then in attending religious services, nearly half of the US population say they do not, they seldom or never attend religious services on a given year. So what we're seeing is not just a an increase in people not affiliating with religion, but also an increase in behaviors that suggest that people are abandoning religion in other ways. And as sociologists will tell you, the behavior is the first thing to go, right? Like people start going to church, and maybe the next thing to go is that affiliation, uh, in which means that you don't go to church, you don't feel member of that community anymore, and you just stop calling yourself member of that community that you don't go, and then you probably stop believing at some point, but that doesn't necessarily have to go, because particularly in this country where the tradition is very Protestant and relationships with God may be very personalized, you don't really need a religion to be connected to God, but that doesn't mean you also have to identify as a Christian to connect with whoever is your that God. And there's some evidence that that God, that person that people think of as a God is not the Yahweh that most Christians believe in, but something a little different and less intrusive. With that in mind, what does it mean when I'm talking about the secular plateau? And by that I mean whether Christianity is making a comeback and secularism is stalling. And here I have four headlines that I was just doing a cursory look at what has been said about this Pew survey that came out in, I believe, was in March or April. And this is just a few of the headlines. This one is from a podcast. The first one on the left is a podcast from VODs, Explain It to Me, where they're talking about why Gen Z is getting more religious. And so they ask Gen Z people who are getting more religious. But the question is, are Gen Z people getting more religious, or is Gen Z as a group getting more religious? It's very unclear from the headline. And even the podcast is more unclear. And actually, that prompted me to write one of the pieces. Then we have Religion Unplugged, which is a religious publication. Surging Catholic conversions signal quiet revival in a secular age. Now we're talking about like a little bit, Terry McTingley has a little bit of a persecution complex. And so now we are into a lot of people have been converted to Catholicism. What does that mean? And what does that mean? A lot of people doing it is enough to become a trend, or is just journalists finding stories of people that are converting to Catholicism? Remember that these larger trends don't mean that there's no movement around. There's people who are raised secular or non-religious that become religious, and there's people who are raised religious and become secular. That's happening less and less, in the sense that fewer people who are raised non-religious are joining religious congregations. So most people who are raised religious stay secular. But the question is, like, are these Catholic conversions, are secular people becoming secular? I mean, secular people becoming Catholic, or people from other religions joining the Catholic Church? Then there's the Economist of America's Gen Z has got religion. And then they talk about a long decline in the number of Christians have leveled off because of Gen Z. I'm not sure about that either. And then the PBS News, the survey shows that U.S. population leveling off after declining for years. And these storylines are usually the growth of the knowns has plateaued, is not going, it's not going anywhere. At the same time, the decline of Christianity has slowed down. And then particularly that young Gen Z adults are returning to religion, whatever that means. And here is a comparison of the Pew survey, just looking at that religious identification numbers, but comparing it to Christians. And if you look at that, you see that certainly is not the case that the non-religious have stopped growing. I mean, in a 7-year period between 2007 and 2014, there was a 7-point increase and now a 6-point increase in 10 years. So you could call that slowing down, but at the same time, there's a 9-point decrease in the 10 years between 2014 and 2024 in people who identify as Christian. So is that leveling off, particularly when you take into account that these figures are not exactly equivalent? Because in 2007 and 2024, the US population is very different, not just in composition, but also in size. So for example, between 2007 and 2014, the decline in Christianity meant that about 500,000 people every year stopped identifying as Christian, or essentially at least 500,000 fewer Christians every year than expected from that baseline, while there were nearly 3 million more people every year identifying as non-religious. Between 2014 and 2024, then is 750,000 identifying, fewer people identifying as Christian between 2014 and 2024, and 1.9, almost 2 million people more identifying as secular. You could say that the difference between a growth of almost 3 million to a growth of almost 2 million in both periods, it's a slowdown, but that's still much faster growth than the decline of Christianity. So even when you account for the fact that there's fewer Christians proportionally, there's still more Christians in the country than there were in 2007 just because of population growth. And then here comes the question of, is Gen Z going back to religion? And so here is the share of Christian and secular adults, but only for those ages 18 to 29, the same time period. Normally, younger people tend to be less religious. Usually, it was assumed traditionally that people were just rebellious in their youth and then they will come back to the fold or get religion as they married and got children. That has not been the case in recent years. In this case, in 2007, 68% of young adults were Christian, 25% non-religious. By 2014, 55%, just a smaller majority, were Christians, and more than 1/3 were non-religious. And in 2024, they're basically even. There's a small Christian plurality, if you want to call it that. But essentially, they have leveled to the extent that there's no Christian majority among young adults right now, today. And even so, it could be possible that if the trend continues, even counting people who are not Christian but are religious, like Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindus, maybe in the next survey, whenever that happens, you would have a non-religious majority among the young adult population. So that also doesn't give credence to the idea that young people are going back to religion. And what suggests is that a few things may be happening. One is that among the young, there's some sort of polarization in the sense that right now we're talking about these trends almost 20 years old. And so people, the people who were young in 2007, 18 to 29, that included me at that point, actually, they have had children. They have gotten married. They have gotten, they're raising their own kids. Some of them may have had kids already at that point, and they raised their children as non-religious. And then their kids are young in 2024, and now they're showing that they're non-religious. But the people who remained religious from that cohort in 2007, maybe are raising their children to be more pious. And essentially, we have a qualitative difference into what it means to be a Christian in 2007 and 2024, because you're losing a lot and of the people that were nominally Christian, and now they have decided that they're not Christian anymore, that they are just non-religious and they don't identify with the tradition. So why these storylines are happening, I think one is maybe making too much of year-to-year data. And by that, I mean, if we go back to that first chart of the General Social Survey, there's a lot of variation from year to year in which way you may have a bump or a decline. At some point, I think the Gallup poll show like maybe 2 straight years of decline of people identifying as non-religious. And they made a big story about that. I think one of the PRRI also showed something like that. And so there was a lot of stories about that. But it's very different, especially the way surveys are constructed, that, year to year difference, it's going to make, you need to make that much of a fuss about it. Then the second is misrepresenting in some cases, and a lot of people does misinterpreting what secularism means. And by that I mean it's not just the people who are leaving religion, but also the fact that people who are growing up with no religion, which is an even larger cohort now than it was in 2007. So, for example, almost 1/3 of the people who are secular today were raised as non-religious, while in 2007 it was 1 in 5. So that's also happening, in the same way that religious people are replicating themselves in the sense that they're taking their children to churches and showing their religious traditions. Secular people are raising their children with no religion. Now, what that means, I don't know, because there's so many ways of being secular, in which one may be just religiously apathetic, and just your parents didn't care about religion, and you're not caring about religion, but that doesn't mean you have like a atheist identity as an atheist activist, or a humanist identity as someone who practices humanism in a way. And then we're not talking about smaller, like Unitarian Universalist churches or ethical society organizations that they're secular religions, or many people are not necessarily believers, but they belong to a congregation, and that's a whole different concept that needs to be studied a little bit more. And then there's also the third storyline, is the focus on individual stories rather than trends. And I think that special talks about these Catholic conversions, in which I remember a few months ago after the election, I was interviewing in a radio station in Bridgeport, Connecticut, about the Latino vote, and the host asked me about the immigrant Latinos who were voting to deport people, and I was telling him that it's a country of 300 million people. I mean, more than 300 at this point, probably closer to 400. And you can find anything, like there's everything in there. And if you're a journalist and you're writing a story, yeah, you can find an anti-immigrant immigrant the same way that we can find an atheist who converts to Catholicism. That doesn't make it a trend. It just makes a person who was an atheist and became Catholic. Although, to be fair, the stories, especially in the podcast that I was listening, and some of the stories I'm listening, there's not necessarily people who are coming from secularism, but essentially either people who are becoming Catholic because their Protestant denomination is too liberal, and they lack that aspect of the fact that women cannot be ordained, and very conservative social views, which, by the way, for cradle Catholics, people who were raised as Catholics, are not that important. They're not as obsessed with the bishops as the comforts are, uh, and with the theology. Uh, and then at the same time, you have people who were tangential or culturally Catholic who are like rediscovering their faith and also like practicing a more conservative way. So I'm not sure to what extent that those individual stories don't represent a trend, and especially looking at the numbers uh, for young people under 30, it doesn't pass muster. Like the young people are not returning to religion. Some people may be practicing more conservative ways of religiosity, and maybe we can talk about that later. But that doesn't seem to be the case. That younger people are becoming more religious. Uh, and then the question is, what is the next boom? Uh, and I was thinking about this because maybe let's assume that yes, the current secular boom has stopped, that now we're going to be seeing a leveling off of the people who identify as non-religious. Uh, Maybe that may be the case for the simple reason that A, this is not supply side economics. Like, we cannot expect eternal growth. I don't think anybody expects that the U.S. population it's going to become 100% secular or non-religious in the next 10 years. Uh, so in that regard, yeah, maybe there may be a leveling off, but what does that mean? It's that is as people are non-religious, raising non-religious kids, and those kids don't join a religion, as they have not been doing for the last few years, uh, the population may continue to grow, not as fast. The other aspect is there may be also fewer people leaving religion because all the people who were tangentially religious, who now don't have that stigma of saying that they're not religious, have left. And so the people who are leaving, who are staying in religious organizations or staying religious, are very different from the people who are leaving. And so fewer of them are probably going to leave. So in that regard, I think those dynamics may be changing, but we don't know. So where the next boom is gonna come, and the question is, it may not change in identification, but we can see the attitudes of people toward religion. And what we see is that secular identification may not increase dramatically more, but certainly you can also expect religion to make big gains either. And by that I mean is that belief, belonging, and behaviors are just some of the indicators of the decline in religion in the United States. So non-belief and the declining service attendance are also part of that trend, not just the identity. And it can take many forms. Secularism can take many forms, and not necessarily all the roads are going to lead to disaffiliation. So the people may be secular in different ways or practice their life secularly, because there's a credibility crisis in American religion. And that is what I think may be the source of the next wave of disaffiliation, or at least the next wave of stagnation of American religion. So here I have a few, I have a few numbers I have gotten around. I have collected from surveys in different places. I'm trying to, okay. So these come from Pew Research Center, the same religious landscape survey that I've been talking about. They ask a question about public school teachers leading their classes in prayer. And then they ask two versions of the question. One in which, in orange, the teachers pray in the name of Jesus, and then the teachers pray in the name of God, but not specifically to a religion. So generic God versus Jesus specific. And these bars represent the people who oppose. And as you see, more people generally are opposed to prayers that are Jesus specific, so specific Christian prayers, while they are less likely to oppose, although not as much, prayers that refer to God in a generic kind of way. But if we look at the Christians, non-Christian religious people, and the secular, they have very different opinions, and you have two essentially big groups. You have the Christians, who generally are not opposed to it. So the majority want those prayers in the name of Jesus or of God, not particularly different in there. And then those who are religious but not Christian, and those who are secular, are more opposed to a Jesus-specific prayer and less opposed, although still a majority are opposed, to a prayer in schools or teacher-led prayers in school, not necessarily students doing their own thing as they can. And so as we are getting into a new era in which the Christian right has gotten what amounts to a coup d'etat right now, and we're seeing more displays of religiosity overtly from the government, it's good time to remember that this is not particularly popular among big segments of the populations, and that even among Christians, and I'm not including this chart because it gets busy and complicated, it's mostly evangelicals, the ones who want Jesus in their prayers. They kind of like skewed the numbers compared to mainline Protestants and Catholics, who still a majority prefer prayers, but not to the extent that evangelicals do at 80% or so rates, more in the 50s and 60s for Catholics and mainline Protestants. So when we're looking at this next wave, I mean, we may still looking at people who don't like religion to be imposed in their lives, where they're fine with religion, but not imposed in their lives. Now we look at different questions. They were asked by Pew, PRRI at different points, and only 1 in 5 adults say that churches and houses of worship should come out in favor of one candidate over another. This was from Pew. The other one from PRRI is the third bar that says should be allowed to endorse political candidates. So it's essentially the same question in different versions and with the same result. So this is very consistent that most people, and I'm talking about only 1 in 5, want their churches to be political and to endorse candidates. Most people don't want churches to get involved with that. Only 31% say the churches should express their views on social and political questions. Again, they don't want the opinion of churches. And then a majority of people, this is of all religions, say that churches are too involved in politics. So as we see more involvement of religious leaders and the federal government proposing and showing overt displays of support for Christianity, these positions are not particularly popular, and so they could have that backlash effect in terms of people turning away from religion. Moreover, the Gallup organization has been asking this question probably for 25 years now, of confidence in different organizations. And what we see is I just used 3 points in time, 2005, 2015, 2025, because it makes it easy. But essentially, the proportion of people who have a great deal or quite a lot confidence in organized religion has shrink from a majority in 2005 to just a plurality in 2025, which is not particularly different statistically from the people who say some or even very little or none, who were less than 1 in 5 in 2005 and now comprise 3 in 10 of the every adult in the United States. So what we're seeing is also a decline in the trust in organized religion over time, that is not limited only to people who are non-religious, but also everybody else in the country. As you can see, out of these numbers are larger than the number of secular people in the country. And then satisfaction with the influence of organized religion has leveled off in the sense that in 2005, a majority were satisfied with the influence of organized religion. This is, of course, most of you may be too young for this, but like the George W. Bush years, in which there was a lot of influence of organized religion, but not to the extent that organized religion is having an influence in 2025, in which now essentially the American public is divided on to whether they're dissatisfied or satisfied. And by the way, dissatisfaction doesn't necessarily mean that people don't want religious to get involved in politics, but it may be to the extent that either they want religious leaders to have other types of opinions other than just right-wing conservative. Is essentially looking a little bit more at the data. It suggests that there are some people who are more necessarily progressive, who are dissatisfied with the way in which conservative voices have become the face of American religion. But because of that, to some extent, it's why the secular boom has happened. And so the takeaways, and I'm going to try to close in the next couple of minutes. Secularism is more complex than just religious identity. So there's a lot of focus on this religious identity and the people who identify as non-religious, but the fact is that religious practices such as church attendance and religious and even religious beliefs are changing. I have actually a newsletter in which I talk about prayer and belief in hell and belief in heaven, and those have also declined. And so it's not just a matter of just God and just church attendance, but across the board, these behaviors and beliefs are changing. And even if the growth of the non-religious has slowed down, doesn't mean that especially Christianity is rebounding. A lot of the conversation about religion coming back is essentially a code word for Christianity. And because minor religions are doing fine. They may not be growing, but they're also not shrinking to the extent that Christianity has been shrinking. And then I think the final part is that distrust and dissatisfaction with religion and its influence in public life is continuing to grow. And many of these people who are dissatisfied with the role of religion and the influence of religion are not necessarily people with a secular identity. So maybe they will adopt a secular identity if they continue thinking that this particular brand of Christianity is giving a bad name to all brands of Christianity. And you may see some growth about that. Whether that is going to be explosive growth again, I'm not sure. But I don't think we have seen the last of the growth of the non-religious yet. And so thank you. You can check my newsletter, Secular Politics, or visit my co-founded project, The Secular Vote, with the QR codes in your screen. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take your questions and have a conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. So again, everyone, if you'd like to drop your questions in the Q&A box, I will go ahead and read them on your behalf, and we can get some answers out to you all. And anything we don't get to, we can certainly follow up on via email. I see some QR codes here that you all are welcome to scan as well, in case we don't get to your questions. I'm sure we can have Juhem's contact information is probably available on those sites. So let's go ahead and jump in. So I see first real question I have here are, so do these charts of not attending religious services apply to religions that don't believe in God, such as Unitarians, Buddhism, Humanist Judaism, or is it just Christians who are not attending services?
No, it's general, the general population. So it's not just Christians. It's mostly Christians, of course, because I mean that's just the vast majority of people. And then I think this is a good point to talk. I have this beef, for lack of a better word, in terms of how we ask these questions, because for the most part, and I think these questions from the audience gets to the heart of my problem with a lot of the religion surveys, which is that it does allow us to understand these changes over time, but it's basically a very Christian perspective in the way these questions are worded. Because I mean, like not necessarily every tradition has like a church attending kind of like tradition, or in the way that Christians are expected to go every Sunday or Saturday, or in the case like even the option of going more than once a week is a very evangelical option, right? Like, I would say that mostly evangelicals and maybe old Catholic ladies are the ones who answered that particular option of more than once a week. And so, yeah, it does include everybody. But again, we need to think about what does it mean when we're interpreting into different religious groups, because of course, like not all religious groups have those kind of traditions, or kind of like enforce it in a way that say that if you don't go weekly, like you're a bad Christian. I go to an ethical society congregation, and I don't get policed about my attendance. And I'm very welcome every time I show up, and then I'm probably missed when I don't show up, but I don't think it makes me a bad person or a bad practitioner of my ethical values.
Great, thank you. And we have several people who are asking for some of these charts, for use, for their own use in their chapters and things. Where could they go about finding some of this information?
Can you should after this send me a reminder, and I'll just like make it public share so you can copy it and
Okay.
Look at it.
I can send it out to everyone.
Yeah.
And we have someone who's asking, is there any way to quantify the loss from a specific denomination, Southern Baptist, Mormon, etc.?
That's trickier. I think I know Pew does a big job of that. Like if you look at their questionnaire, it's ridiculously long, and it's because it tries to go into like, okay, you're a Christian, like what kind of Christian you are, and then like, and so they have those, and if you go into the website of the religious religious landscape survey, you will be able to find that. In the case of me focusing on these larger trends, I don't really care. I think for me it's TMI. It's too much information what they have in there, especially for me as I've been looking over the years. The term evangelical, for example, like I think there's a lot of people who don't use the term evangelical who you will describe as evangelical because of the theological implications of their church affiliation. And so, so it becomes, when we're using these terms, they become really tricky. But you can find that information from their website. And then you have groups like Mormons, which in these type of large surveys, you can actually make some inferences, but most surveys are not going to give you the robustness to actually be able to analyze Mormons. But in the case of this Pew survey, you can do it. Some of the PRRI surveys, you can do it. The American Values Atlas, or the cooperative election study, who has like large numbers of respondents.
Great. Then I have a question here from Gustavo. Do you have data to show the percentage age of religious versus secular voters voting for the Democratic versus Republican Party in each of the last few decades? I would like to see if there is data showing an increase of secularism, but not as much of an increase amongst progressive voters.
Sure. No, I do have answers for that. So every 4 years, and you can go, actually, you should go to the secular vote. It's in there. Every 4 years, I have been writing this piece since 2012. I started with when I was at PRRI, in which I call it the secular vote since 1980. And so every 4 years I update it. So I just did the secular vote since 1980 for the secular vote in this case. And this one is using exit polls because it's the one that has been running around since 1980. There are much better surveys now, and I have included some analysis of what. The reason I'm sending you to the secular vote is because I have been posting those stuff in the secular vote. But yes, so secular voters, for example, are usually 2-1, 3-1, depending on the election, more Democratic leaning than Republican leaning on presidential elections. They are less likely to be partisan. So, and this is, I think it's something very important to know about secularism in general, is that it comes from a lot of people who are non-religious. I wouldn't call them non-joiners, but there is an element in which I wouldn't also call it apathy, but there's and I'm also not that young, so I may be wrong about this, but I think a lot of the growth has come with not only this distrust in organized religion that stems from the hypocrisy that we can see in religion every day, but also in distrust in institutions. And so if you see secular voters and secular people in general are less likely to identify as Democrat or Republican. They are the most likely to identify as nonpartisan. And yeah, most of those people, when they vote, eventually vote more likely Democratic than Republican. But for the most part, yes, they have not just less religious attachments, but also less partisan attachments that reflect politically. So yes, and then I did a piece. I'm trying to remember the book, and you can contact me offline if you want. Send me a message through Secular Politics, or because I also published a piece on in a book chapter at some point. I need to find it in my archives, but essentially looking at people who identify as liberal, which is not the same as progressive, but when you have these questions that you don't have any control of, there was a bump in the proportion of people in the United States identifying as liberal. And essentially, I wrote this piece in which shows that it was the increase in the proportion of liberals was actually associated with an increase of secular people. And in fact, I wouldn't say the vast majority, but a plurality and an overrepresentation of people who identify as liberals in the United States actually are secular. So there's an element in there, but I think a lot of these people are more progressive and more liberal than democratic leadership, and actually they will identify themselves as so. And as such, they even when they are more progressive, they also have not necessarily particularly good opinions of the Democratic Party, but they definitely loathe the Republican Party.
I have a quick question for you personally, and um, hoping maybe other folks are thinking this as well. We talked a lot about like the wording of these polls. Do you feel like if we started including terminology like culturally Jewish, for example, or culturally Muslim, right, or rather than just like such a binary sort of religious or non-religious viewpoint, that we would see a big spike in the number of people who are non-believers but may still attend church or some sort of other house of worship? Or do you think that matters much?
I think you can do that in a way. The problem is that it gets too complicated too fast, because you're trying to gather data, and so that's why I think a lot of, and I'm not very familiar with this area of research, which is like more qualitative, like looking at interviews and looking at like what people are thinking through their process. My old mentor, Barry Cosmin, and Ariela Kesar, who hired me to work for them back in 2007 at the Institute for Secularism, have a long scholarship on cultural Judaism. So there's research in there. I'm not sure about Muslims, and then of course there's these aspects of people. I know people who call themselves cultural Catholics. I never consider myself one of them. But yeah, there are those nuances in there, and the question is how. And that's why I think like just looking at identification is very hard, because it doesn't give you like you can't consider. I had a friend who once told me, I'm a Catholic. I don't believe in the virgin birth and like whatever, but like I'm a Catholic, and I was like, no, you're not. I mean, theologically speaking, you're not, but you consider yourself a Catholic. You are a Catholic, and so those questions are hiding all those meanings, and I mean, you can't go sideways through them, and what you see is that a lot of people who call themselves being part of a religion are not necessarily active members of that religion, and may just be part of it because it's the thing to be. I mean, my wife is from Mexico. I mean, I've known very religious Mexicans, but I mean, you go to Mexico City and like people have medals of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and they're not necessarily practicing Catholic, but it's an identity thing, right? It's a Mexican thing, and so it's very nuanced. All these, and so that's why I always want to look at these beliefs and these behaviors, because it tells you more about the context in which these people are religious or not, and by making it binary that you identify or not, that makes you religious or not, it's not necessarily as easy.
Yeah. I have a question from Walter Hill. Looks like the conclusion is that there is an increase in the number of people who see themselves as Christian is based on only one survey. Isn't the margin of error large enough so you do not really know that if there's a trend? Looks like the margin of error is often around 3%, he says.
Yes and no. So for example, the way that Pew does their thing is like, these surveys have over 30,000, sometimes 50,000 people. So, they're very robust. PRRI's is it's actually a collection of weekly surveys. So at the end, they have like 100,000 in very good years, or 50. Most years they maybe have 50 to 60,000 responses, which is also pretty robust. The CES is 60,000, and then Gallup, the way they measure them, is also kind of like through weekly surveys that they do. So at the end, they have like, I don't know, 50,000 cases or whatnot, which, it's not a 3% margin of error. Although, again, like, the math works a little different because it's not one survey, but a compilation of surveys. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this discussion comes because two data points at some point showed, and there were a couple of surveys that were showing that, or at least a couple of studies. I think it's possible, but again, at the same time, I think it's less important the results of the survey and more important the reaction, because I call it the great freak out, these avalanche of articles talking about how bad is that Americans are losing their religion. But the fact is that things are crazy in the country, not because people are losing their religion, but because there's a particular group of religious people who have gone off the deep end. So the problems of the country is not particularly due to people losing their faith or their religious identity, but to other particular groups. But there's a large segment of the American elite who consider being religious being a good thing, and that losing religion shows bad for the country. And so I think it's less about the methodology and it's more about what people want to extract from these stories.
Great. We have about 2 minutes left, so we'll get to one more question here. And this, if you're able to answer it in 2 minutes, we'll see. This seems like a big one. So Gustavo chiming in here again saying, I see your chart on the website. What do you attribute the decline of secular Democratic voters from 2008 to 2020?
Other than everybody loved Barack. So I think there was a spike from everybody in 2008. Even the Latino vote was like crazy for Obama in 2008. And I mean, I have to do some more analysis, and I'm planning to do, because this is my favorite thing, like, to doing at this political data. But I think part of it's also secular people are very likely, most likely than any other religion cohort, to vote for third-party candidates. So they're the most likely to vote for somebody who is not a Democrat or a Republican. I think in the 80s and 90s, it reflected more on the Republicans. You have a lot of like kind of libertarianish, not voting for Republicans and ended up voting for Ross Perot and the likes. And then in these recent more years, there's been like a lot of people going with Ralph Nader, Jill Stein, and the likes. So I think that's part of it, in which like Obama was able to get a lot of support, and with no serious, or at least buzzy kind of like third-party candidate in 2008, was able to get a level of support that has not been matched ever since or before.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, that wraps up our time for questions. Again, you can feel free to scan this QR code to be connected to one of these sites, and you can follow up on this subject matter. And certainly, I'm sure we can answer any questions via email. I will also go ahead and share this slideshow out to everyone who is here in attendance. Sounds like you don't have any problem making this public slideshow, so you all will be able to reference some of these numbers as well in your local chapters. Again, thank you everyone for showing up today and for this engaging conversation. Thank you again, Juhem, for being here with us. Really appreciate your insight and look forward to some of your research moving forward, and certainly we'll be subscribing to your newsletter as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All righty. Well, thank you all, everybody, again, and we'll go ahead and sign out for today. Bye-bye.